The main room makes use of an entrance feeling, making the player feel as though they've stumbled into something much larger than they realized. In addition, an observant player will notice the multiple openings further up the wall. Although they won't know the significance of these openings yet, the intention is to seed their existence into the player's mind so they can recognize their purpose later on in the game. Moving forward, the player will encounter the final two major blueprint sections, the yellow respawn pads and the red traps. The yellow respawn pads have a sphere collider attached to them that, when touched by the player, will activate two specific functions in the player's blueprint: change checkpoints and yes teleports. The yes teleports function serves as an additional UI widget to the player's screen and also activates the bool that permits for teleportation. Additionally, a sister function of the opposite type is attached to several box colliders that occur after each challenge room to disable this function, in order to ensure a player does not accidentally warp themselves past a door that has been closed behind them. So how does teleporting actually work? There are two times when a player will be teleported: when they voluntarily teleport upon touching a checkpoint inside a challenge room, shown here with the UI widget displaying the T permitting for teleport, or whenever they are crushed by a ceiling-mounted trap that they have triggered. When one of these two conditions is triggered, with the manual teleport requiring an additional check to confirm that the player both isn't dead and that teleports are currently allowed, the teleport-triggered event is called. This event sets the player to no longer be seen as dead, a process which will be explained in greater detail shortly. Once the administrative task is complete, it plays a teleport sound for the player that I imported, and begins a process of checking which checkpoint the player has currently touched. It is worth noting that I could probably clean this function up significantly given additional practice and development time, but this process functions for the task at hand. For each checkpoint, there is an accompanying bool. If this bool is true, it then calls a teleport function on the player and targets the attached teleport pad, which is set individually in a manner similar to the doors explained earlier. If the first checkpoint bool is false, it then checks for the next checkpoint bool, and will trigger the appropriate teleport function depending on which bool is flagged as true at the time. As was stated previously, whenever a checkpoint is touched by the player, a change checkpoint event is called. This event works in a very similar process to the teleport event, although it checks the object IDs of the teleport pads previously touched instead of the bools, and then proceeds to set the appropriate branch to true or false if it hits a match. Once it hits a match, two things are done. It will call a reset event, which will reset all checkpoint bools to false, and then it will set the desired checkpoint bool to true, permitting all previously described teleport functions to target the appropriate checkpoint. The final complex blueprint is the death trigger, which occurs whenever a player overlaps with the box trigger attached to the bottom of a ceiling-mounted trap object. Firstly, in order to trigger a trap, the player must overlap with the appropriate trap trigger box. Using a similar method to the object check for the checkpoints, the trap trigger checks to see if the object that overlapped it was the player. If this is true, it flips a simple bool called in kill zone. This bool ties into an event tick in which the trap trigger is constantly checking the status of the bool to determine which event to feed into the trap that is referenced by the collision. Each of these triggers, much like the door, are hardwired to affect only a single determined object set in the editor. The previously mentioned events Trap Triggered and Trap Reset both reference a specific Trap Handler object, which serves to move the object relative to an invisible parent object. The purpose for this was to prevent me from needing to actually determine the precise location of the trap before setting it up, which significantly reduces the required development time and complexity for setting up each trap. You may have also noticed two floats that are present: kill speed and reset speed. These are separate variables so as to allow additional customization of the trap's functionality. Some traps come down slower than others, allowing the player to attempt to dodge the trap or quickly get under it. Others come down swiftly upon the player, but reset slowly after crushing them, so as to give a heavy-handed signal as to what caused the player's death. Upon overlapping with the first-person character, the trap will reduce a float number in order to activate a specific event. You may remember from earlier that when a player is teleported, this float is reset to a positive value. This is where that float is decremented for the purposes of activating the I am dead event from earlier that sets the player to being recognized as dead. On every fraction of a second, the player controller checks to see if the player is dead. If it is confirmed that the player has been recognized as dead, a set of particle effects that are normally invisible have their visibility triggered to indicate to the player that they have died, as unfortunately I do not yet have the animation competency to indicate this in the traditional fashion. You might have noticed that there is a bool to check if a sound has been played. This is because the way this blueprint is written, the sound effect that plays upon death kept being continuously triggered, a problem that was solved by the introduction of this simple bool. After 2.5 seconds, just enough time for the player to appreciate that they have died, the teleport trigger function from before is activated, which, as shown previously, resets the bool that states the player is dead, restores their health, and also moves them back to the safety of the respawn pad, whilst also deactivating the visibility of the particle effects and resetting the sound played bool so that the sound can play again the next time the player is crushed by a trap. As was stated almost all the way at the beginning of this video, it is worth noting that during this 2.5 second window in which the player is recognized as dead, their controls are frozen by a simple branching bool in order to prevent unintended interactions while they are dead. This concludes the blueprint explanations for the duration of this video, although they will be briefly referenced throughout the remainder of the level design explanation.